On a scorching afternoon in August 2023, hunters tracking a buck deep in Idaho's Frank Church Wilderness, the largest continuous wilderness in the lower 48, stumbled upon something that still keeps me up at night.
Wedged inside a narrow rock crevice, 11 miles from the nearest trail, two figures lay curled on the bare earth.
A man and a woman, naked, skeletal, alive but barely. When the man lifted his head and opened his mouth, the hunter saw nothing but raw, swollen gums. Not a single tooth remained. The woman was the same. 64 teeth gone. Every last one.
Their names were Garrett Mercer and Shelby Dawes. They had vanished 4 years earlier during a backpacking trip, a trip that was never really about hiking. It was a secret affair, and Garrett's wife, Lorraine, a surgical nurse with 14 years of operating room experience, had learned the truth the day they disappeared. What happened in those 4 years? Who took their teeth, one by one, over months, in total silence? The evidence points somewhere, but the law says it points nowhere.
My name is Leonard. I'm 65. I've walked through jungles, deserts, and war zones across 6 continents. But this story, right here in America's own backyard, is one of the most unsettling I've ever told. Now, before we go further, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from right now. And if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button. You're going to want to hear how this ends.
Boise, Idaho sits in a valley cradled by dry brown foothills and the distant blue shadows of the Sawtooth Range.
In June of 2016, the city was deep in the grip of early summer. The temperature is already pushing into the high 80s by mid-morning. The air sharp with the smell of sagebrush and hot asphalt, sprinklers hissing across every front lawn on every quiet suburban street.
It was the kind of weather that made people dream about getting out, heading north, heading into the mountains. And that is exactly what 2 people were planning to do, though not for the reasons they told anyone. Garrett Mercer was 41 years old. He was a real estate attorney at a mid-sized law firm in downtown Boise, the kind of man who filled a room not because he was loud, but because he was built to be noticed. 6'2", broad-shouldered, with a square jaw that looked like it had been carved out of the same granite that lined the canyons he was about to walk into. He kept his dark hair cropped short, parted neatly to the side, and he dressed the way lawyers in small western cities dress. Pressed shirts, no tie, leather shoes that cost more than they needed to. He had a firm handshake, a confident smile, and the kind of calm, steady voice that made clients trust him with their life savings. To the people around him, Garrett Mercer looked like a man who had everything figured out. Shelby Dawes was 33. She worked as a financial consultant at the same law firm, and on paper, she was everything a young professional in Boise aspired to be. Slender, athletic, with sharp green eyes and auburn hair she usually kept pulled back in a loose ponytail. She had the kind of face that was pretty without being intimidating, freckles across the bridge of her nose, a quick, easy laugh that made people feel comfortable around her. She ran half marathons on weekends, volunteered at a local animal shelter on Tuesday evenings, and had a golden retriever named Birdie that she brought to the office on casual Fridays. She was, by every account, warm, likable, and genuinely kind. She was also Lorraine Mercer's best friend. The affair between Garrett and Shelby had been going on for nearly a year. It started at the firm's Christmas party in December of 2015, the way these things often do. Too much wine, a conversation that went too long, a shared cab that ended at a hotel room neither of them had planned to book. After that night, they met once a week, always in places where no one would see them. Motels on the outskirts of town, Airbnb cabins in McCall, 2 hours north, a small studio apartment that Shelby had rented under a separate name, paid for in cash, known to no one. In early June of 2016, they decided to take a trip together. Not a night in a motel, not a weekend in a borrowed cabin. A real trip. 4 days of backpacking into the Frank Church River of No Return wilderness. the largest continuous wilderness area in the lower 48 states, spanning over 2.3 million acres of deep canyons, ponderosa pine forests, and hundreds of square miles of land where no trail has ever been cut. To make it happen, they lied. Garrett told his wife, Lorraine, that he had a 5-day business trip to Portland. Client meetings, he said. He would be back by the weekend. Shelby told her coworkers that she was going to Spokane to visit her mother. On June 10th, both of them registered for a backcountry permit at the Middle Fork Ranger District under their real names. The plan was simple. Hike the Soldier Creek Trail down to the Middle Fork of the Salmon River, camp at 2 designated sites along the riverbank, and return to the Boundary Creek trailhead by the afternoon of June 15th. On the morning of June 12, 2016, a security camera at the last gas station before the Forest Road captured a dark red Jeep Grand Cherokee pulling up to the pump at 6:20 in the morning. Garrett was behind the wheel, wearing a blue flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows. Shelby was in the passenger seat, a white baseball cap pulled low over her eyes. They were laughing. They looked relaxed, happy, like two people at the beginning of an adventure. That footage, 17 seconds of grainy, sun-washed video, is the last confirmed image of Garrett Mercer and Shelby Dawes before they disappeared. The trailhead logbook at Boundary Creek recorded Garrett's signature at 8:15 that morning. A commercial rafting group spotted 2 hikers matching their description walking along the riverbank at around 1 in the afternoon, approximately 5 miles in. The rafters said the pair waved as they passed. One of the guides remembered the woman's white cap. After that, nothing. No sightings, no signals, no traces. As if the earth had opened its mouth and swallowed them whole. June 15th, the day they were supposed to return, came and went. June 16th, June 17th, June 18th. The dark red Jeep sat untouched in the trailhead parking area, collecting a thin film of dust on its windshield. The first person to raise the alarm was Carla Voss, a 38-year-old administrative assistant at the law firm. Carla was a small, efficient woman with reading glasses perpetually perched on the tip of her nose, the kind of person who kept the office running without ever being thanked for it. When Garrett did not show up for the Monday morning board meeting on June 20th and did not answer his phone, Carla called Lorraine. Lorraine Mercer was 39. She was a surgical nurse at St. Luke's Health System, where she had worked for 14 years. A tall woman, lean and sharp-featured, with dark blonde hair she always wore in a tight, practical bun. Her colleagues described her with one word that came up again and again: controlled. Lorraine controlled everything: the family schedule, the finances, the meal plans, the vacations. She spoke in short, precise sentences, rarely raised her voice, and had a way of looking at people that made them feel like she was already 3 steps ahead of whatever they were about to say. When Carla called and said Garrett was supposed to be in Portland, Lorraine confirmed it. Yes, he was on a business trip. But Carla told her no. The Portland office had called asking why Garrett had canceled his appointments without notice. He had never gone to Portland at all. The line went silent. 8 seconds. Then Lorraine said very quietly, "I see. Thank you," and hung up. That same day, when Shelby failed to appear at the office and did not respond to emails, a concerned coworker called her mother in Spokane. Her mother said Shelby had not visited. She had not called. She had no idea where her daughter was. Within hours, everything collapsed. Police checked the backcountry permit records and found both names, Garrett Mercer and Shelby Dawes, on the same permit, the same trip, the same tent. The affair was no longer a secret. It was a headline. Lorraine Mercer learned that her husband had not gone to Portland, but into the wilderness with her closest friend at 4 o'clock in the afternoon on June 20th, 2016. According to Carla Voss, who delivered the news by phone, Lorraine did not scream. She did not cry. She did not break anything. She simply said, "I will handle it," and ended the call. The search began on June 21st, but this was the Frank Church Wilderness, a place that even the most experienced rescue teams referred to as the land God forgot. The Middle Fork Canyon drops more than 5,000 feet, Dense forest canopy blocks visibility from above. Radio signals die against the canyon walls. For 3 weeks, 60 personnel combed the area. Helicopters flew grid patterns over the ridgelines. Search dogs were deployed at multiple points along the trail. Kayak teams paddled the river, scanning every bank, every eddy, every pile of driftwood. They found nothing. Not a single hair, not a footprint, not a scrap of fabric. By August of 2016, the case was officially closed. The working theory was simple and sad: an accidental fall into the canyon or a drowning in the river. 2 lovers lost to the wilderness. Case filed. Case forgotten. But not by everyone. In the weeks that followed the closing of the case, the town of Boise did what small cities do when tragedy strikes close to home. It talked.
It talked in grocery store aisles and church parking lots, in break rooms and over backyard fences, in text threads and Facebook comments that multiplied like weeds.
The disappearance of Garrett Mercer and Shelby Dawes was not just a missing persons case. It was a scandal. A married man and his wife's best friend vanishing together into the wilderness on a trip built entirely on lies. People had opinions. People had theories. But most of all, people had sympathy. And nearly all of it was directed at one person: Lorraine Mercer. Now, I have already told you certain things about Lorraine: that she was 39, that she was a surgical nurse, that she was tall and lean and sharp-featured, that she kept her dark blonde hair in a tight bun, and that the word her colleagues used most often to describe her was controlled. But to understand what happened next, you need to understand what that word really meant when applied to this particular woman. Lorraine Mercer had spent 14 years as a trauma surgical nurse at St. Luke's Health System, not in a quiet outpatient ward, not in a pediatric clinic, but in the operating room, where people were cut open and stitched back together while machines beeped and blood pooled in steel basins beneath the table. She had held retractors while surgeons sawed through bone. She had clamped arteries with steady hands while patients flatlined on the table. She had watched people die, not once, not twice, but enough times that death had become a procedural event rather than an emotional one. Her hands did not shake. Her voice did not waver. In 14 years, not a single surgeon had ever seen Lorraine Mercer lose her composure in the operating room. Garrett himself used to joke about it. He told friends at dinner parties that if Lorraine had been born in another century, she would have been a general. He said it with a laugh, the way husbands say things about their wives that are meant to sound admiring, but carry a faint edge of something else, something closer to unease. Because Lorraine did not just control the operating room, she controlled everything. The family calendar, color-coded and updated every Sunday night. The household budget, tracked to the penny in a spreadsheet she reviewed weekly. The meal plans, the vacation itineraries, the children's school schedules. They had no children, but if they had, you can be certain every permission slip would have been signed 3 days early. She was not cruel. She was not cold, exactly. But she operated her life the way she operated in surgery, with precision, with discipline, and with an absolute intolerance for anything that deviated from the plan. After the truth about the affair became public, Lorraine became the center of an enormous wave of community sympathy. Betrayed by her husband, betrayed by her best friend. It was the kind of story that writes itself. The loyal wife, the faithless husband, the treacherous friend. People brought flowers to her door. Co-workers left cards and casseroles on her porch. The women's group at her church organized a prayer vigil for the missing couple, and someone, perhaps without thinking, included Lorraine's name on the invitation. Lorraine declined everything. She did not accept the flowers. She did not eat the casseroles. She did not attend the prayer vigil, and she did not acknowledge the cards. She gave no interviews to the local press, despite repeated requests. She issued no public statements. She did not post on social media. She simply continued to go to work, come home, and close her door. There was only one moment when she spoke publicly, and it became the most replayed clip in the history of KTVB News in Boise. A reporter, A young man named Dylan Marsh, 26, fresh out of journalism school at the University of Idaho, with an eager face and the microphone he held too close to people's mouths, caught Lorraine outside the St. Luke's parking garage one evening after her shift. He asked if she had any message for Garrett, wherever he might be. Lorraine stopped walking. She turned to face the camera. Her expression did not change. Her eyes were flat and dry. And she said, in a tone so even, it could have been reading a grocery list, "Everyone gets what life has in store for them." The clip aired that night. By morning, it had been shared more than 200,000 times. People argued about what it meant. Some said it was the quiet dignity of a woman in pain. Others said it was something far darker, a declaration, a verdict delivered with surgical calm by a woman who had already decided what she believed and what she intended to do about it. The debate never reached a conclusion. It simply became part of the story, one more unsettling detail in a case that was already full of them. In September of 2016, less than a month after the search was officially called off, Lorraine sold the 4-bedroom house she had shared with Garrett in the Boise suburbs. She sold it quickly, below market value, as if the speed of the transaction mattered more than the money. She closed their joint bank accounts, canceled their shared credit cards, and within 72 hours erased nearly every financial trace of her marriage. Then she bought a property, a 40-acre parcel of forested land with a small, aging log cabin on it in Stanley, Idaho. Stanley, population 63. A town so small it barely qualified as a town at all, tucked into a high mountain valley at the edge of the Sawtooth Range, surrounded on all sides by national forest and federal wilderness. The nearest full-service grocery store was over an hour's drive away. The nearest hospital was even farther. And the property Lorraine purchased sat at the very edge of the settlement, its back 40 acres bleeding directly into federal land. Land that, if you walked far enough through it, connected to the Frank Church River of No Return wilderness. The same wilderness where Garrett and Shelby had disappeared. She paid for the property in cash. The money came from the life insurance payout that Garrett's law firm had issued after he was presumed dead. She transferred her nursing credentials and took a position at the Sawtooth Medical Clinic, the only medical facility within 50 miles. It was a small operation, 2 examination rooms, 1 part-time physician, and now 1 full-time nurse. The physician was Dr. Hugh Brennan, a 61-year-old family practitioner with a white beard, wire-rimmed glasses, and the unhurried demeanor of a man who had chosen to spend the last chapter of his career treating ranchers for barbed wire cuts and tourists for altitude sickness. Dr. Brennan later told investigators that Lorraine was the finest nurse he had ever worked with, meticulous, efficient, and unflappable. But he also mentioned something that, in hindsight, unsettled him. "She asked me about sedatives," he said. "Not in an unusual way. She was a nurse. Professional questions were normal. But she was specifically interested in ketamine dosing for adults. The proper amounts, the onset time, the duration. And she asked about midazolam, how it could be used to induce temporary amnesia, anterograde amnesia specifically. I assumed she was refreshing her knowledge. Now, looking back, I am not so sure." The purchases Lorraine made over the following years were later compiled by investigators into a timeline that read like a supply list for something no one wanted to name. From an online surplus medical equipment site, she bought a set of used dental extraction forceps, the kind of heavy, steel-jawed pliers designed to grip a tooth at the root and pull it free from the bone. The account was registered under the name L. Monroe. The delivery address was a P.O. box in Challis, Idaho, a small town 40 miles from Stanley. From the farm supply store in Stanley, she purchased 50 feet of steel chain, 6 industrial padlocks, and 2 sets of livestock hobbles, heavy ankle cuffs designed to restrain large animals like horses or cattle. From Costco in Boise, where she drove every 3 to 4 weeks beginning in early 2017, she bought cases of bottled water, canned food, blankets, and industrial-grade garbage bags, quantities that were 5 to 6 times what a single person living alone would reasonably need. And from ATMs in Sun Valley, never in Stanley, always in Sun Valley, 30 miles to the south, She withdrew $200 to $300 in cash every 2 weeks, like clockwork, for nearly 4 years. Her nearest neighbor was a man named Ray Jessup. Ray was 73, a retired cattle rancher with sun-damaged skin and hands like leather gloves, the kind of man who had lived in the Idaho mountains his entire life and minded his own business as a matter of principle. His ranch sat 2 miles down the road from Lorraine's property, close enough to be considered a neighbor by Stanley standards, far enough that visits were rare. But Ray noticed things. He noticed that Lorraine's ATV, a mud-spattered Polaris Sportsman, could sometimes be heard running on the forest road behind her cabin late at night. Not occasionally, regularly. Between 11 at night and 1 in the morning, sometimes later, in summer and in winter, in rain and in snow. The sound of that engine cutting through the darkness became a familiar part of Ray's nighttime routine, as regular as the coyotes howling from the ridge. He asked her about it once, just once. Lorraine told him she was checking her fence line because she worried about wolves getting to her livestock. Ray nodded politely and said nothing more.
But Ray Jessup had lived next to that property for over 30 years. He knew every acre of it, and he knew, with absolute certainty, that Lorraine Mercer did not own a single head of livestock.
"4 years is a long time. Long enough for a town to forget. Long enough for a case file to gather dust in a drawer that no one opens.
Long enough for the people who once searched the mountains with flashlights and helicopters to stop searching, stop wondering, and start accepting the simplest explanation, that the wilderness had taken 2 people and was never going to give them back. By the summer of 2020, the names Garrett Mercer and Shelby Dawes had faded from public conversation in Boise. The affair, the scandal, the search, all of it had been folded into the past, replaced by newer tragedies and fresher gossip. The dark red Jeep Grand Cherokee had been towed from the trailhead years ago and eventually sold at auction. Shelby's golden retriever, Birdie, had been adopted by a coworker. The law firm had hired a new real estate attorney. Life, as it always does, had moved on. And then, on a burning hot afternoon in August of 2020, the wilderness gave them back. Owen Hadley was 26 years old and built like a person who had spent his entire adult life on rivers. He was not tall, 5'9" at most, but he was broad across the chest and shoulders, with thick forearms roped with tendon and a permanent tan that stopped in a sharp line at his wrists where his paddling gloves ended. His hair was sun-bleached and shaggy, his nose slightly crooked from a kayak collision 2 seasons earlier, and he had the easy, unhurried confidence of a young man who was very good at one thing and had organized his entire life around doing it. Owen had been guiding commercial rafting trips on the Middle Fork of the Salmon River for 4 years, running groups of tourists through Class 3 and 4 rapids in the deepest section of the Frank Church Wilderness. He knew the river the way a taxi driver knows city streets, every bend, every eddy, every rock shelf that could flip a raft if you hit it at the wrong angle. He had seen bears from his kayak. He had pulled a drowned elk out of a logjam with his bare hands. He thought, by the age of 26, that he had seen everything the river had to offer. He was wrong. It was just after 3 in the afternoon on a cloudless August day, the kind of day where the sun turns the canyon into an oven and the river is the only relief. Owen was leading a group of 8 clients, weekend adventurers from California mostly, with new gear and nervous smiles, on a 5-day guided trip down the Middle Fork. They had stopped for a rest at a small sandbar on the inside of a sharp bend, about 30 miles downriver from the Boundary Creek put-in. The clients were waiting in the shallows. Miguel Reyes, Owen's co-guide, a quiet, compact 24-year-old from Twin Falls with a dark buzz cut and a calm disposition that made him excellent in emergencies, was unpacking a cooler of sandwiches on the bank. It was Miguel who noticed first. He stopped what he was doing, squinted upriver, and said very quietly, "Owen, look up." Owen looked. On a rocky outcrop, roughly 30 meters above the waterline, on the far side of the bend where the canyon wall rose steep and jagged, 2 figures were standing. They were motionless. Owen's first thought was fishermen. It was not unusual to see backcountry anglers along the river. But something was immediately wrong with the image. The figures were too still. Not the stillness of someone watching the water or choosing a casting spot, but the rigid, locked stillness of people who had forgotten how to move. He reached into his dry bag and pulled out a pair of compact binoculars. What he saw through the lenses stopped his breath. 2 people, 1 male, 1 female. They were nearly naked. What remained of their clothing, shreds of fabric, blackened and stiff with dirt, hung from their hips in strips, barely covering anything. Their skin was dark, not from ethnicity, but from years of sun and filth, a deep reddish brown that made them look almost like they were carved from the rock they stood on. Their hair was long and matted into thick, tangled ropes that hung past their shoulders. The man was skeletal. Owen could count his ribs from 30 meters away. His arms hung at his sides like dead branches, and his legs were thin enough that his kneecaps looked grotesquely oversized. The woman was the same, gaunt, hollowed out, her collarbones jutting forward like the frame of a ship beneath paper-thin skin. Neither of them moved. Neither of them waved. Neither of them called out. They simply stood on the rock and stared down at the river with eyes that Owen later described as empty, like looking into 2 windows of a house where no one lives anymore. Owen shouted up to them. His voice echoed off the canyon walls and came back to him in fragments. There was no response. The figures did not flinch, did not turn their heads, did not acknowledge that they had heard anything at all. Owen exchanged a look with Miguel. Neither said a word. They both understood that something was very wrong. They left the clients on the sandbar with instructions not to move and began climbing the bank. The rock was loose and steep, and it took them nearly 15 minutes to reach the level of the outcrop. When they were about 10 meters away, close enough to see details that the binoculars had only hinted at, the man slowly turned his head. His movement was mechanical and stiff, the way a rusted hinge turns, as if the muscles in his neck had partially forgotten their function. Owen stopped. He raised one hand in what he hoped was a non-threatening gesture and called out again. Easy, calm, the same voice he used when a client was panicking in Whitewater. Hey, buddy, are you okay? Do you need help? The man opened his mouth. Owen expected words, a cry for help, a name, a question, anything.
But what he saw instead silenced him completely. Inside the man's mouth, there was nothing. No teeth, not a single one. Just raw, swollen gums, dark purplish red, receding and inflamed, stretching across empty jawbone like wet clay pressed over stone. The man made a sound, a low, guttural moan that started deep in his chest and came out shapeless and broken, the sound of a human voice that had lost the architecture it needed to form language. Owen felt his stomach lurch. He would later write in his official incident report, filed with the Custer County Sheriff's Department, that the man's mouth looked like the mouth of a very old infant, toothless, raw, and somehow obscene. I nearly vomited on the spot. The woman turned next. She moved even more slowly than the man, her head rotating on her neck with the same mechanical stiffness. And when she faced Owen and Miguel directly, she opened her mouth as well. The same image, gums stripped bare, not a single tooth remaining. She produced a sound, a thin, trembling whine, like a dog that has been beaten too many times and no longer knows whether the hand reaching toward it carries food or pain. And then she dropped to her knees. Without warning, without any transition between standing and collapse, she simply folded downward, pressed her palms flat against the rock, and began crawling backward toward the tree line behind the outcrop. Her eyes, wide and glassy and unfocused, never left Owen's face. What followed was 2 hours of patient, agonizing effort.
Owen and Miguel sat on the rock, keeping their distance, speaking in low, steady tones the way you speak to a wounded animal. They set bottles of water on the ground between them and the two figures, and waited. The man eventually crawled forward, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, his hands shaking so violently that when he finally grasped a water bottle, he could not hold it. He clutched it against his chest with both arms and tipped it toward his mouth, and the water ran down his chin and neck because his lips could not form a proper seal without teeth to hold them in place. The woman would not come forward. She lay curled on the bare rock behind the man, her knees drawn to her chest, her eyes open and staring upward at the sky, with an expression that Owen could only describe as gone, like she was looking at something the rest of us couldn't see. Owen asked the man his name. The man stared at him for a long time, and Owen was not sure the question had been understood. Then the man spoke. The word that came out was distorted, slurred, pushed through gums and a tongue that had no teeth to press against. It sounded like "Ge-we." Owen asked him to repeat it. "Ge-we." Again. "Ge-we." It was not until later that evening, when Owen was giving his statement to the sheriff's deputy at the hospital, that the name finally clicked into place. The man had been trying to say Garrett. The rescue was coordinated by satellite phone. A helicopter from the Idaho County Sheriff's Department was dispatched and arrived within 90 minutes, hovering over the canyon until a suitable landing zone was identified on a gravel bar half a mile downstream. 2 paramedics hiked in with a litter, thermal blankets, and IV kits. When they reached the outcrop, the man, Garrett, allowed himself to be touched, though he flinched at every contact and kept his arms wrapped around his torso as if trying to hold himself together. The woman had to be carried. She did not resist, but she did not cooperate either. She was limp, passive, her body yielding to the paramedic's hands the way a cloth doll yields to a child, without will, without preference, without any indication that she understood what was happening or cared. They were flown to Eastern Idaho Regional Medical Center and arrived just after 9 o'clock that evening. Identification was confirmed within the hour through fingerprint matching and a small tattoo on the inside of the woman's left wrist, a simple line drawing of a mountain peak, which her mother later confirmed Shelby Dawes had gotten during a trip to Portland in 2014. The man was confirmed as Garrett Mercer through fingerprints on file with the Idaho State Bar. The news broke before midnight. 2 people, missing for more than 4 years in the largest wilderness in the continental United States, had been found alive on the banks of the Middle Fork of the Salmon River. Their names were Garrett Mercer and Shelby Dawes, and neither of them had a single tooth left in their head. The emergency room at Eastern Idaho Regional Medical Center was not built for cases like this. It was a mid-sized regional hospital, competent and well-staffed, accustomed to treating ski injuries in winter and dehydration in summer, the occasional ranch accident, the occasional car wreck on Highway 93. The trauma bay had 4 beds and a team that rotated in 8-hour shifts, and on most nights at least 2 of those beds were empty. On the night of August 14, 2020, both occupied beds held patients who had become the most studied, most debated, and most whispered about medical cases in the state of Idaho's recent history. Garrett Mercer was in Bay 1. Shelby Dawes was in Bay 2. A curtain separated them, but the sounds carried. The steady beep of heart monitors, the low murmur of nurses, and occasionally, from Bay 2, a thin, keening whine that rose and fell like the cry of an animal caught in a trap. That sound was Shelby. She made it every time someone touched her. The attending physician that night was Dr. Ramona Voss, no relation to Carla Voss at the law firm, though the coincidence of the surname would later cause minor confusion in press reports. Dr. Voss was 44, a small woman with dark curly hair cut close to her head and the kind of tired, steady eyes that come from 20 years of emergency medicine. She had treated gunshot wounds, frostbite, rattlesnake bites, and once, memorably, a man who had been dragged 40 yards by a horse with his boot caught in the stirrup. She considered herself difficult to shock, but when she pulled back the thermal blanket covering Garrett Mercer and began her initial assessment, she paused. She set down her penlight. She looked at the nurse beside her, a young woman named Tammy Liu, 28, efficient and quiet, and said, very softly, "Get me the camera."
And call the sheriff. The medical report compiled over the following 72 hours documented a catalog of damage that read less like a hospital chart and more like an inventory of prolonged suffering. Both patients presented with severe malnutrition. Garrett's body weight was estimated at approximately 60% of normal for his height and frame, Shelby's at roughly 55%. Chronic dehydration had left their skin papery and loose, hanging from their bones in folds that made them look decades older than they were. Both were infested with intestinal parasites, identified through stool samples as a combination of Giardia and roundworm, consistent with years of drinking untreated water. Their feet showed peripheral nerve damage, a condition called peripheral neuropathy, likely caused by prolonged exposure to cold, poor circulation, and vitamin deficiency. Shelby could not feel her toes at all. Garrett had limited sensation in both feet and walked with a shuffling, unsteady gait that the physiotherapist compared to that of a person recovering from a stroke. But it was the scars that drew the most attention from the forensic team. Both Garrett and Shelby had small, circular marks on their wrists, not cuts, not burns, but abrasions worn into the skin over time, the kind of marks that form when something tight and hard presses against the same spot for months or years. The forensic pathologist who examined the marks described them in his report as consistent with prolonged restraint by metal cuffs or chains. The marks were bilateral, present on both wrists of both patients, and they were old. Layers of scar tissue had built up over repeated cycles of abrasion and partial healing, suggesting that whatever had caused them had been applied, removed, and reapplied many times over an extended period. And then there were the teeth, or rather, the absence of them. That was what turned a missing persons recovery into something else entirely. Something that made the sheriff's deputies look at each other across the trauma bay with expressions that were no longer relief, but dread. Dr. Kenneth Novak was called in from the University of Idaho's Forensic Sciences Department 3 days after the rescue. He was 57, a forensic odontologist with a national reputation, a tall man with a shaved head and reading glasses that he wore on a chain around his neck like a piece of jewelry. He had identified remains from house fires, plane crashes, and mass graves. He had testified in 11 murder trials. He was not a man given to overstatement, and when he described the condition of Garrett and Shelby's mouths in his 22-page report, the clinical precision of his language made the findings all the more disturbing. Garrett Mercer, 0 of 32 teeth remaining. 14 tooth sites showed evidence of mechanical extraction. Fractured root tips still embedded in the alveolar bone indicated directional pulling force consistent with the use of dental extraction forceps, a specialized tool designed to grip a tooth at the root and leverage it free. The fracture patterns were not random. They were clean, angled, and uniform, indicating that whoever had wielded the instrument understood the biomechanics of tooth removal. 10 additional sites showed bone resorption and gum recession consistent with advanced periodontal disease, most likely scurvy caused by severe vitamin C deficiency over a prolonged period. The remaining 8 sites were indeterminate. The bone had healed sufficiently that the original cause of tooth loss could not be established with certainty. Shelby Dawes, 0 of 32 teeth remaining. The pattern was similar. Approximately 12 sites showed the same mechanical extraction signatures: fractured roots, directional force, clean leverage angles. The remainder were attributed to disease or classified as indeterminate. In both patients, the gum tissue had healed to varying degrees across different sites, indicating that the teeth had not been lost all at once, but over a period that Dr. Novak estimated at several months to several years. Some extraction sites were fully healed, the bone smooth and remodeled. Others still showed rough edges and incomplete closure, suggesting they were more recent. The most critical finding was what was not found. Not a single tooth was recovered. Not from the patients' mouths, not from their digestive tracts, not from the rocky outcrop where Owen Hadley had discovered them, and not, as investigators would later confirm, from any location within a 5-mile search radius of the discovery site. 64 human teeth had simply ceased to exist. Someone had taken them, and someone had kept them. Dr. Novak's conclusion was measured, precise, and devastating in its restraint. The combination of pathological and mechanical tooth loss is unambiguous, he wrote. However, determining whether the mechanical extractions were self-inflicted as a result of pain, desperation, or psychiatric disturbance, or performed by a third party, falls outside the scope of forensic odontology and belongs to criminal investigation. With that sentence, the case crossed a line from which it would never return. 3 weeks of psychiatric interviews followed. They were conducted by Dr. Nina Castillo, a forensic psychiatrist attached to the Custer County Prosecutor's Office. Dr. Castillo was 51, a slender woman of Filipino descent with silver-streaked black hair and a manner so calm it bordered on hypnotic. The kind of clinician who could sit in silence for 10 minutes without discomfort, waiting for a patient to find words that might never come. She had evaluated defendants in capital murder cases, survivors of hostage situations, and victims of prolonged domestic captivity. She had seen what extended trauma does to the architecture of the human mind, and she understood, perhaps better than anyone involved in the case, that the truth inside Garrett and Shelby's heads might be permanently unreachable. She interviewed them separately, in a small room at the hospital with beige walls and a single window that looked out onto the parking lot. Each session was recorded. Garrett went first. His account came in fragments, broken sentences interrupted by long silences, sudden changes of subject, moments where he would stop speaking entirely and stare at the wall, as if watching something move across it that no one else could see. He said they had gotten lost on the second day. He said they had fallen into a ravine, injured themselves, minor injuries, scrapes and bruises, and found a rock shelter to wait in. He said that after some time, maybe days, maybe weeks, I do not know, someone began to come. Always at night. He and Shelby would be blindfolded with cloth that smelled familiar, clinical, like hospital linen and bleach. The person never spoke. Not one word. Not ever. There was only the sound of breathing, of footsteps, and of metal clicking against metal. A sound Garrett described as like scissors opening and closing, but heavier. And then the pain. Pain that started in his mouth and exploded through his entire skull. Pain so severe that he lost consciousness. When he woke, his mouth would be full of blood, and there would be a new gap where a tooth had been. This happened again and again, each time separated by what felt like a very long interval. He could not say how long. Weeks, maybe months. Before some of the extractions, he was given something to drink, something that made his body go soft, made his limbs refuse to obey his mind, but left his senses intact. I could feel everything, he said. I just could not move. Shelby's account, given in a voice so quiet that Dr. Castillo had to lean forward to hear, matched Garrett's in its essential details, but added a dimension that was, if possible, even more disturbing. She said that sometimes, before anything happened, the person would simply sit beside them in the darkness, not touching them, not speaking, just sitting, breathing, for what felt like hours, as if watching, as if savoring. That person knew exactly what they were doing, Shelby said. One tooth at a time, no rush, like it was a ritual. She also described a smell. Hand soap, the antibacterial kind, like in an operating room, that accompanied every visit. But Dr. Castillo's report was careful to note that both patients also described experiences that were clearly hallucinatory. Garrett spoke of dark shapes living inside the rock walls, of voices whispering from the river, of trees that moved when he was not looking. Shelby described similar phenomena. Both exhibited symptoms consistent with complex PTSD, dissociative disorder, and significant cognitive impairment. Dr. Castillo's conclusion was clinical, cautious,
and ultimately fatal to any prosecution. It is not possible to determine the boundary between genuine memory and the products of a severely damaged mind. The testimony of both patients is insufficiently reliable for prosecutorial purposes. The teeth were gone. The minds that might have explained their disappearance were broken. And the truth, whatever it was, remained locked somewhere in the darkness between memory and madness.
The investigation into what had happened to Garrett Mercer and Shelby Dawes during their 4 years in the Frank Church Wilderness was assigned to Detective Martin Cowell of the Custer County Sheriff's Office.
Cowell was 53, a career law enforcement officer who had spent the last 22 years working in rural Idaho, where the cases were few, but the distances were enormous, and the silence of the landscape had a way of swallowing evidence the way a river swallows stones. He was a big man, 6'3", 230 pounds, with a heavy jaw and a thick gray mustache that he trimmed every Sunday morning with a pair of barber's scissors his father had given him. He wore the same style of boots every day, broken in Ariats with mud permanently caked into the stitching, and he drove the same department-issue Ford F-150 that he had driven for the last 9 years, its odometer long past 200,000 miles. Cowell was not flashy, he was not fast, but he was thorough in the way that only a man who has spent decades working alone in vast, empty country can be. Patient, methodical, and unwilling to close a file until he had turned over every rock, even the ones that looked like they had nothing underneath. From the first day he reviewed the medical reports, Cowell focused on a single person of interest. He did not say her name publicly. He did not seek a warrant immediately. He simply began to build a case, piece by piece, the way a mason builds a wall, one brick at a time, checking the level after each one. Lorraine Mercer. The circumstantial evidence against her accumulated slowly, but when laid out end to end, it formed a line that pointed in one direction with uncomfortable consistency. First, the geography. Lorraine had moved from Boise to Stanley, population 63, a speck of a town that happened to sit at the exact gateway to the Frank Church Wilderness, within 3 months of Garrett's disappearance. Her 40-acre property bordered federal land, and the back of her parcel connected directly to a network of unmaintained forest roads and game trails that led, without interruption, deep into the wilderness. There were no checkpoints, no gates, no cameras. A person with an ATV and a knowledge of the terrain could travel from Lorraine's back fence to the interior of the Frank Church without being seen by a single human being. Second, the purchases. Cowell had subpoenaed Lorraine's financial records, her credit card statements, her store loyalty accounts, and the transaction logs of every retailer within 100 miles of Stanley. What he found was a pattern. 50 feet of steel chain, 6 industrial padlocks, and 2 sets of livestock hobbles from the farm supply store in Stanley. Items that, individually, were unremarkable for rural Idaho, but collectively were consistent with the physical restraint of human beings. A set of used dental extraction forceps, the exact type of instrument that Dr. Novak had identified as capable of producing the fracture patterns found in both victims' jawbones. Purchased online from a surplus medical equipment dealer under the name L. Monroe, shipped to a P.O. box in Challis, Idaho, a small town 40 miles south of Stanley. Massive quantities of bottled water, canned food, blankets, and industrial garbage bags from Costco in Boise, purchased every 3 to 4 weeks for nearly 4 years, in volumes 5 to 6 times what a single person living alone would need. And cash, $200 to $300 withdrawn every 2 weeks from ATMs in Sun Valley, never in Stanley, always in Sun Valley, as if someone wanted to create a gap between where the money was taken and where it was spent. Third, the knowledge. Lorraine Mercer was not an ordinary citizen purchasing unusual items. She was a 14-year veteran of the surgical operating room. She understood human anatomy, the structure of bone, the architecture of nerves, the way tissue responds to trauma. She knew how to control bleeding. She knew how to manage pain. And she had, according to Dr. Hugh Brennan at the Sawtooth Medical Clinic, shown specific professional interest in 2 drugs, ketamine, a dissociative anesthetic that paralyzes the body while leaving sensory perception largely intact, and midazolam, a benzodiazepine that induces anterograde amnesia, the inability to form new memories. Garrett's description of being given something that made him soft, unable to move but able to feel everything, was, as Cowell noted in his case file, a textbook description of sub-anesthetic ketamine. Fourth, the smell. Both Garrett and Shelby, independently and without knowledge of each other's statements, had described the same olfactory detail. A scent of antibacterial hand soap, clinical, medicinal, like an operating room. Cowell confirmed that Lorraine used Hibiclens, a chlorhexidine-based surgical scrub, as part of her daily professional routine. The scent of chlorhexidine is distinctive, sharp, chemical, and unlike any soap available in a grocery store. It is a smell that belongs in hospitals, and nowhere else. Fifth, the night movements. Ray Jessup, Lorraine's nearest neighbor 2 miles down the road, had confirmed hearing Lorraine's ATV on the forest road behind her property late at night, between 11 at night and 1 in the morning, on a regular basis, year-round, for the entire duration of the 4 years that Garrett and Shelby were missing. Sixth, the emotional response, or rather, the absence of one. From the moment Lorraine learned that her husband had disappeared with her best friend, she had not cried publicly, had not asked for help, had not expressed grief or confusion or anger in any way that anyone could recall. The only public words she had ever spoken about the situation were 7. Everyone gets what life has in store for them. Cowell laid all of this out in a 68-page investigative summary and submitted it to the Custer County Prosecutor's Office. He believed he had a case. He believed the evidence, taken as a whole, told a story that was as clear as it was horrifying. A betrayed wife, a woman of extraordinary discipline and medical expertise who had located her husband and his lover in the wilderness, restrained them, kept them alive, and systematically extracted their teeth over a period of years as an act of prolonged, deliberate punishment. But the law does not run on belief. The law runs on proof. And proof was exactly what Martin Cowell did not have. Lorraine's defense attorney was Margaret Chen, and she was a problem. Chen was 47, a criminal defense lawyer based in Boise with a reputation that preceded her into every courtroom she entered. She was small, barely 5'2", with a round face, wire-rimmed glasses, and straight black hair that she kept in a blunt cut just above her shoulders. She looked, by all appearances, like a librarian. But Margaret Chen had never lost a murder trial in 17 years of practice, and she had a mind like a scalpel. Precise, fast, and capable of cutting through an argument so cleanly that the opposing side did not realize they were bleeding until they looked down. She took Lorraine's case pro bono, which itself became a subject of speculation. Why would one of Idaho's most expensive defense attorneys represent a small-town nurse for free? Chen never explained. She simply went to work. And she dismantled the case piece by piece. Living near a wilderness area was not a crime, she argued. Thousands of people in Idaho lived on properties that bordered federal land. Steel chain and livestock hobbles were standard agricultural supplies in a state where ranching was the primary economy. The account under L. Monroe that purchased the dental forceps had no digital fingerprint, no biometric data, no DNA, and no traceable connection to Lorraine Mercer. The initial L could belong to anyone. Medical knowledge was not evidence of criminal behavior. Millions of nurses across America understood ketamine pharmacology. The victim's testimony had been officially classified as unreliable by the forensic psychiatrist, and most critically, there was no physical evidence. No DNA, no fingerprints, no hair fiber, no biological trace of any kind placing Lorraine Mercer at any location where the victims had been held. Cowell's team had searched Lorraine's cabin, her property, her vehicle, and a 5-mile radius of surrounding wilderness with dogs, ground-penetrating radar, and a 12-person forensic team. They found no cave, no structure, no improvised holding site, nothing that bore any trace of human captivity. If such a place existed, it had been cleaned with a thoroughness that bordered on surgical. And then there were the teeth. 64 of them, missing from 2 human mouths. They were not in the wilderness. They were not in Lorraine's home. They were not in her vehicle, her workplace, her storage units, or any location connected to her by ownership or routine. They were nowhere. If Lorraine had kept them, she had hidden them in a place that no search warrant, no dog, and no technology could reach. In March of 2021, County Prosecutor Sandra Iverson, a 55-year-old career prosecutor with steel gray hair and a reputation for caution, convened a grand jury. For 2 weeks, 12 citizens of Custer County reviewed the evidence, heard testimony from Cowell, Dr. Novak, Castillo, and several supporting witnesses. When the vote came, it was 7 against indictment and 5 in favor. Not enough. Sandra Iverson stood before the press cameras outside the courthouse on a cold March afternoon and delivered a statement that would be quoted in every article, every podcast, and every documentary about the case for years to come. "Suspicion is not evidence," she said. "Coincidence is not a crime. The justice system requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and we do not have that." The public disagreed. Within days, the story had gone national. A true crime podcast called River of No Return launched a 12-episode series on the case that attracted millions of downloads. The hashtag #LorraineDidIt began trending across every major platform. Reddit threads analyzed every purchase, every timeline, every word Lorraine had ever spoken publicly. A TikToker named Jake Something, 22, shaggy hair, ring light, the usual, drove to Stanley and filmed himself standing in front of Lorraine's property, narrating his theories into his phone. The video got 14 million views. Strangers sent threatening letters to Lorraine's P.O. box. Her cabin windows were smashed twice in a single month. She installed security cameras on every corner of the house and hired a private security guard, a retired Boise police officer named Hank Drucker, 60, barrel-chested and silent, who sat in a truck at the end of her driveway from dusk to dawn. Through all of it, Lorraine Mercer did not leave Stanley. She did not move. She did not hide. She went to work at the Sawtooth Medical Clinic every morning, came home every evening, and closed her door. She did not issue statements. She did not hire a publicist. She did not appear on television. Her attorney, Margaret Chen, spoke publicly only once in a brief press conference outside her Boise office, where she said 7 words that matched her client's own economy of language. "My client is a victim of betrayal and now a victim of rumor. She owes no one an explanation." And that was it. No charges, no trial, no confession, no denial. Just a woman in a cabin at the edge of the wilderness, living her life as if the rest of the world did not exist. The law had spoken. The court of public opinion had screamed, and Lorraine Mercer sat in the silence between the two, untouched and unreachable, like a stone at the bottom of a river that the current cannot move. After Garrett Mercer was transferred from Eastern Idaho Regional Medical Center to a long-term trauma recovery facility in Missoula, Montana, in October of 2020.
The facility was called Clearwater House, a former ranch property that had been converted into a residential treatment center for patients recovering from severe psychological trauma.
It sat on 12 acres of flat grassland at the edge of the Bitterroot Valley, surrounded by cottonwood trees and a wooden fence that was more decorative than functional. The staff were experienced, the therapists were patient, and the rooms were designed to feel as unlike a hospital as possible. Warm lighting, soft furniture, windows that opened onto views of the valley floor. It was, by all accounts, a good place to begin putting a broken mind back together. But some things, once broken, do not reassemble the way they were before. Some things just learn to hold their shape differently. Garrett spent 2 years at Clearwater House. In the early months, he barely spoke. He attended therapy sessions, but sat in silence for most of them, staring at the floor or at his own hands, occasionally writing short phrases on a notepad when the effort of forming words with his toothless mouth became too much. He was fitted with a full set of dentures, upper and lower, within the first month, but he wore them only when required to eat soft food and removed them immediately afterward. He told his therapist, a woman named Dr. Ellen Marsh, 50, kind-eyed, with a soft voice that never pushed, that the sensation of something foreign inside his mouth triggered panic attacks. Not mild discomfort, full-blown episodes, racing heart, tunnel vision, the feeling of hands holding his jaw open in the dark. The dentures stayed in their case. Garrett learned to eat without them, mashing food with his gums, favoring soups and porridge, and anything that did not require chewing.
He communicated primarily through text messages sent from a phone he kept on his person at all times, typing out what he could not say because his pronunciation, without teeth to anchor his tongue and lips, had become slurred and indistinct, the words melting into each other like candle wax. He never returned to the practice of law. The cognitive assessments conducted during his stay at Clearwater showed significant impairment in executive function, short-term memory, and sustained concentration, the very skills that had once made him a capable attorney. Whether this damage was caused by malnutrition, toxic exposure, psychological trauma, or some combination of all three, was a question his doctors could not answer with certainty. What they could say was that the Garrett Mercer who had walked into the Frank Church wilderness in June of 2016, confident, sharp, professionally accomplished, was not the Garrett Mercer who walked out of Clearwater House in the fall of 2022. That man was gone. The person who remained was quieter, slower, more fragile, and haunted by a past that he could neither fully remember nor fully forget. After his discharge, Garrett moved into a small one-bedroom apartment in Twin Falls, Idaho, a mid-sized city far enough from Boise and Stanley to offer anonymity, but close enough to the mountains that the landscape still felt familiar. His mother, Patricia Mercer, 68, a retired school administrator from Charlotte, North Carolina, with steel-gray hair and a spine that years of widowhood had made even straighter, helped him furnish the apartment and set up the basic routines of independent living. She visited every other month, driving the 4 hours from her own rented house in Boise, bringing groceries and clean towels and the particular brand of oatmeal he preferred. She wanted to help more. She wanted answers. She wanted her son to sit down with her at the kitchen table and tell her what had happened in those 4 years, who had done this to him, and why. But Garrett would not speak about it. When Patricia pressed, and she did press, because she was a woman who believed that naming a wound was the first step toward healing it, Garrett would pick up the notepad he kept beside his chair and write, in the same careful block letters every time, "I don't remember. I don't want to remember." Eventually, Patricia stopped asking. The distance between them, which had once been geographic, became something deeper and harder to cross. Shelby Dawes followed a different path, though it led to a similar kind of solitude. After her initial hospitalization and a 3-month stay at a psychiatric unit in Idaho Falls, she returned to Boise in early 2021. It was a mistake. The city she came back to was not the city she had left. Or rather, the city was the same. It was her place in it that had been erased and rewritten. To some people in Boise, she was a victim, a woman who had endured unimaginable suffering and deserved compassion. To others, she was the woman who had slept with her best friend's husband, the woman whose choices had set the entire tragedy in motion, the other woman who had gotten exactly what was coming to her. These two narratives existed simultaneously, spoken in the same breath by the same people, and Shelby found herself trapped between them, pitied and blamed in equal measure, unable to occupy any space in the community without feeling the weight of both judgments pressing down on her. She lasted 4 months in Boise before leaving for Portland, Oregon. She rented a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood in the southeast part of the city, a second-floor unit above a bookshop, with a fire escape that looked out onto a narrow alley lined with dumpsters and ivy. She lived alone. She had no pets, no partner, no close friends in the city. She attended therapy twice a week with a trauma specialist whose name she never disclosed publicly, and she took medication for chronic insomnia, a condition that had not existed before her captivity and now defined the rhythm of her days. She could not sleep in darkness. Every light in her apartment stayed on through the night,
The overhead in the bedroom, the lamp in the hallway, the fluorescent tube above the kitchen sink. Even the bathroom light remained on, its door propped open with a stack of books so that no corner of the apartment was ever fully dark. Her therapist noted in a session recorded in 2022, a record that was later leaked without Shelby's consent to a true crime blog, that Shelby had described her captor in terms that were precise, clinical, and devastating in their calm. That person did not hate us. That is the scariest part. They were calm, methodical, like performing a surgery. Each tooth, grip, twist, pull, then silence again. I never once heard that person breathe faster than normal, even when I was screaming. Lorraine Mercer, meanwhile, continued to live in Stanley as if the world beyond the Sawtooth Valley had ceased to exist. She returned to work at the Sawtooth Medical Clinic, where Dr. Brennan, who had quietly followed the case in the news but never spoken to Lorraine about it, continued to rely on her as his only full-time nurse. She treated patients, she filed paperwork, she restocked supplies, she drove her ATV on the forest roads when the weather permitted, and stayed indoors when it did not. She did not respond to the media. She did not acknowledge the podcasts, the documentaries, the Reddit threads, the TikTok videos, or the thousands of strangers who had decided, without evidence, that they knew exactly what she had done. She lived with the discipline of a metronome, regular, precise, and utterly opaque. In 2023, the case resurfaced briefly when the FBI, during an unrelated investigation into illegal trafficking of medical equipment, discovered that the account registered under L. Monroe, the same account that had purchased the dental extraction forceps, had also been used to buy 2 vials of injectable ketamine from a black market medical supply network in November of 2016. The transaction records showed the same P.O. box in Chalice and payment in cryptocurrency that could not be traced to any individual. Once again, the evidence pointed toward Lorraine. Once again, it stopped short of reaching her. The line between suspicion and proof remained unbroken, and on the wrong side of it, there was nothing the law could do. Detective Martin Cowell, who had retired from the Custer County Sheriff's Office by this time, agreed to a single interview on the River of No Return podcast. He sat in his living room in Salmon, Idaho, a cup of black coffee on the table beside him, and spoke for 40 minutes in the slow, careful cadence of a man who had spent years carrying a weight he could not set down. His final statement became the most quoted passage in the entire series. In 30 years of law enforcement, this is the only case where I know who did it, I know how they did it, and I know why they did it. But I cannot prove it. That person did not just punish 2 human beings. That person engineered the entire punishment like a work of architecture. No trace left behind, no biological evidence, and the victims kept alive long enough that they would have to spend the rest of their lives living with the consequences. This was not impulsive behavior. This was design. Winter came to Stanley in December of 2024 the way it always did, silently, completely, burying the valley under a blanket of snow so deep that the fence posts along the highway disappeared, and the only sounds were the wind and the occasional crack of a tree branch surrendering to the weight of ice. Owen Hadley, the rafting guide who had discovered Garrett and Shelby on that August afternoon 4 years earlier, drove into town on a gray Tuesday morning to meet with the outfitter who contracted his services for the upcoming season. The meeting was brief. Afterward, Owen walked down Stanley's single commercial block, 3 buildings, a gas station, and a post office, and pushed open the door of the Sawtooth Coffee Company, the only cafe in town. A small room with 6 tables, a wood-burning stove in the corner, and the smell of pine smoke and dark roast hanging permanently in the air. He ordered a black coffee and sat by the window. There were 2 other people in the cafe. One was the barista, a teenage girl with braces whose name he did not catch. The other was sitting alone at a corner table near the stove,
reading a paperback novel with a cup of black coffee placed precisely in the center of a paper napkin. Lorraine Mercer. Owen recognized her immediately. Everyone in Stanley knew Lorraine's face, even people who had never spoken to her, even people who crossed the street when they saw her coming, which some did, and which Lorraine, if she noticed, never acknowledged. Owen had no intention of approaching her. He drank his coffee, scrolled through his phone, and tried not to look in her direction. But when he stood up to leave and reached for his coat on the back of the chair, his eyes drifted involuntarily toward her table. The paperback was lying open, face down on the table beside her coffee cup. Lorraine had paused in her reading and was looking out the window at the snow falling on the empty street. And there, resting between the pages of the book where it had been placed to hold the reader's spot, was a small object, a bookmark. Except it was not a bookmark. It was a tooth, a human tooth, small, ivory white, with the root still intact. A premolar, perhaps, or a canine. Owen could not be sure. It sat between the pages of the novel as casually as a receipt or a folded napkin, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Owen froze. His hand was still on his coat. His heart began to beat in his temples. He stared at the tooth for what felt like a full minute, but was probably no more than 3 or 4 seconds. Then he looked up. Lorraine was looking at him. She had turned from the window, and her eyes were on his face. She did not flinch. She did not reach for the book, or try to close it, or hide what was inside. She simply looked at him with an expression that contained nothing. No guilt, no defiance, no amusement, no threat. Just a flat, bottomless calm, like the surface of a frozen lake that you know is deep, but cannot see into. Then, slowly, without breaking eye contact, she reached forward, closed the book around the tooth, picked it up, and stood. She put on her coat, a dark wool parka with a fur-lined hood, tucked the book under her arm, and walked past Owen toward the door. She did not speak. She did not nod. The bell above the door chimed once as she pushed it open, and then she was gone, her figure dissolving into the snow that was now falling thick and fast across the empty street. Owen stood in the cafe for a long time. The barista asked if he wanted a refill. He did not answer. He was thinking about what he had seen. A tooth. A human tooth, used as a bookmark. He thought about calling the police. He thought about following her. He thought about the 64 teeth that had never been found. The 64 teeth that an entire investigation had failed to locate. That search warrants and forensic teams and cadaver dogs had not been able to produce. He thought about what Detective Cowell had said, that if Lorraine had kept them, she had hidden them somewhere no one could reach. But what had he actually seen? A tooth. It could have been a replica. It could have been a novelty item, a curiosity purchased from an oddity shop.
It could have been an animal tooth, bleached white. It could have been anything. There was no law against using a tooth as a bookmark. There was no crime in sitting alone in a cafe with a paperback and a cup of black coffee. He had no photograph. He had no proof. He had only his eyes, his memory, and the cold certainty in his chest that what he had seen was exactly what he thought it was. Owen Hadley drove out of Stanley that afternoon and did not come back. He moved his guiding work to a different outfitter based out of McCall and never ran another trip on the Middle Fork. He never told anyone what he had seen in the cafe. Not the police, not his friends, not the podcast producers who contacted him repeatedly for follow-up interviews. He kept it to himself, the way people in Idaho keep most things to themselves, not because they do not care, but because they understand that some truths are too heavy to carry in the open and too dangerous to set down. As of today, 64 teeth belonging to Garrett Mercer and Shelby Dawes have never been recovered. No one knows where they are. No one knows with certainty what happened during the 4 years those two people spent in the River of No Return wilderness. Lorraine Mercer has never been charged. She has never confessed. she has never denied. She still lives in Stanley, Idaho, population 63, at the gateway to the largest wilderness in the continental United States. She still works at the Sawtooth Medical Clinic. She still drives her ATV on the forest roads behind her cabin. And on moonless winter nights, Ray Jessup, older now, slower, his hearing not what it used to be, still catches the faint rumble of an engine moving through the darkness beyond his property line. He does not look out the window anymore. He has lived in Idaho long enough to know that there are things in the dark that are better left alone.
And the Salmon River still flows, cold, black, and ancient, carrying its secrets southward through the canyon, the way it has for 10,000 years. It does not explain, it does not confess, it does not deny. It simply moves, indifferent and eternal, through a landscape that has learned to keep its mouth shut.
This story stays with me. Not because of the teeth, not because of the investigation or the rumors or the woman in the cabin who never said a word. It stays with me because of how it started. It started with a lie, a small lie, the kind people tell every day. I am going to Portland. I am visiting my mother. I will be back by Friday.
Simple words, ordinary words. The kind of words that slide out of your mouth so easily you barely notice you are saying them. But every lie is a door, and once you walk through it, you do not always get to choose where it leads. I am not here to judge Garrett or Shelby. I am not here to judge Lorraine. Judgment belongs to God alone, and He sees what we cannot. But I will say this, as a man who has walked through enough of this world to know a few things for certain. The people closest to you are not furniture. They are not background noise. They are living, breathing souls who trust you with their heart every single day. And that trust is the most fragile and most valuable thing you will ever hold in your hands. When you break it, you do not get to decide what happens next. The consequences belong to the world, and the world is not always kind. So, tonight, before you close your eyes, look at the person beside you. Your wife, your husband, your family.
Tell them you love them and mean it. Not because you are afraid of what might happen if you do not, but because love, real love, honest love, is the only thing that keeps us from losing ourselves in the wilderness that lives inside every human heart. Thank you for staying with me through this story. If it meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below and let me know where you are listening from tonight. And if you have not already, subscribe to this channel so we can walk through the next story together. May God bless you. May He keep you safe. May He keep the people you love close and the darkness far away. If you believe that, type Amen in the comments. I will see you in the next one. This is Leonard. Good night.